Joining us now is Dan Wooding of Assist News Service. He recently spent 2 weeks in Kurdistan. Listen, the Kurds like to refer to that part of the country as the other Iraq. You had a chance to meet with Christian believers. Is the church, despite the reports we see in other parts of Iraq, is the church thriving in Kurdistan?
It surprisingly is, George. It's one of the few places in Iraq where there is a complete freedom of religion there, and I was most encouraged to meet several believers there who told me that this is the one place in the whole of Iraq where many of the Christians have fled from Baghdad and other places, come there for safety, and are now worshiping the Lord and are allowed to do this openly.
Dan, you were there at a time period, I think just recently, when there was a massive suicide attack in Baghdad. Is there concern amongst the Kurds, where you spent 2 weeks, is there concern that the violence that we saw in Baghdad and continue to see could move up north, that Erbil could become the next Baghdad?
Well, in fact, they don't seem to be the slightest bit concerned about it. They think the rest of the people of Iraq are crazy, and the Kurds are the only ones who've got it right. And as you mentioned, it's known as the other Iraq because they have not had one killing there of any U.S. soldier since 2003 when Saddam Hussein took power. So they don't seem concerned at all. They just wish that the culture of life that they have in Kurdistan could come to the rest of the country.
You had a chance to meet a very interesting individual, the man who presided over Saddam Hussein's trial, Rizqar Muhammad Amin. A fascinating interview that you held with him. But the thing that caught my attention was that he prayed to God every day to give him wisdom as he presided over the leader of Iraq. Tell us about that briefly.
Yeah, that was so fascinating. I met him at an event there and recognized him, asked if he'd give me an interview, not thinking he would. And he immediately said, yes, I'll talk to you tonight. So he came over to see me. And as you mentioned, I was talking to him. How did he deal with the dictator's tantrums? And he had to try and sort that out. But even though he was a Muslim, he said, every morning before going into court, I would pray to God to give me the ability to not misjudge anybody. And I thought that was very interesting. He was a very moderate Muslim, but he really, after a year, couldn't handle the situation anymore and was very critical of the death. He said that Saddam was killed on an unlawful day where you should not be killing anybody. And certainly those pictures that were shown, those horror pictures, George, should never have been shown. He thought they were disgraceful.
Dan, in addition to meeting with Kurdish believers, you also got a chance to bump into a very tall American Christian who was working the streets of Kurdistan, but had a different calling. He wanted to minister to people in Kurdistan, thousands of miles away from his home. Tell us real quickly about this extraordinary person.
Yeah, he was 6'7", and you couldn't but miss him. 28 years of age. He was teaching as an English instructor at the University of Dohuk in Kurdistan, and a very fascinating man who told me that many of his students had been kidnapped, held for ransom, threatened. Some had been told that they didn't leave, they would be beheaded. And he said because of the color of his skin, he'd been featured widely on Kurdistan television, so he was stopped regularly in the streets, and he was able to share his faith with the people of the country. And he just thought it was a great privilege to live in Kurdistan. And I was just astonished to see this giant of a man there who really stands out. And he's now, I believe, in Baghdad, and he's gone to Baghdad to share the gospel with the people there.
Dan, as you know, we've been covering here on Christian World News, as well as other broadcasts, the plight of Christians in central and southern Iraq. They've almost daily assaults against them, as well as their churches, their houses of worship. What is it like for Christians in Kurdistan? You had a chance to meet nightly for services at an evangelical church. What's it like for Christians in Kurdistan?
It's totally free. I was astonished. We went to this Pentecostal church every night, and it was wonderful. I was with a team of about 28 people, mainly Christians, and we were allowed to minister every night, and we joined in the worship. I didn't know many of the choruses, but it was fascinating because one of the things that we discovered was that the believers there are sure that God is going to use them. In fact, the pastor told me He said, I believe that the church in Iraq will be used by the Lord to bless all the countries of the Middle East. He said, so please don't give up praying for this nation, because the Lord will use it to bring the lost to light. Isn't that amazing that Kurdish Christians believe that God's going to use them to reach out to the rest of the craziness of the Middle East to bring the lost to the light?
Fascinating stuff. A part of the world we don't hear too much about because of the bombs and violence in Baghdad. But Dan Wooden going all the way to northern Kurdistan to report on the amazing work that God is doing in that part of the world. Dan, thanks so much for joining us on the broadcast and sharing your insights.
Thank you, George. It's been a privilege.
Terrific. Thank you, Dan.